Kia ora everyone, Bala Banaka, Talofa Lava, hello, bonjour, hello Keta, kia orana, and a very warm welcome to this Business Link Pacific webinar. Thank you so much for joining us today from wherever you are in the world. Before we get started, I'd like to make a couple of introductions and share some important information with you. Please keep your microphone and camera on mute for the whole webinar. It helps to have a nice clear feed for our presenter today. We'll have one Q&A session today, plus there'll be plenty of opportunities for feedback throughout the webinar. Please ask your questions in the chat box, which is located in the top right-hand corner of your screen. You can do this throughout the webinar. If we run out of time for questions, we will make a note of your question and email you privately with the answer after the webinar if possible. We will also be sending out a recording of the full webinar later today, and it will be available on our website. So for those of you who may have just recently joined the BLP network, either as a business advisor or a growing SME, or even if you've been with us for a little while, here's a quick refresher of what BLP is all about. We are a New Zealand government-funded private sector development initiative delivered by DT Global. We currently work in 6 countries: Samoa, Fiji, Vanuatu, Papua New Guinea, and more recently the Solomon Islands and the Cook Islands. We work in partnership with chambers of commerce, financial institutions, and the private sector to develop a business advisory service provider network in the Pacific region that improves access of business services to growing SMEs. We do this by offering 3 main services. We have an online business health check, which helps businesses identify where there might be gaps that could benefit from business advice. We've also just released the Online Business Continuity Planner, another free business tool similar to the Business Health Check focused on business continuity planning. We have a searchable database of over 90 BLP approved business advisors. All of our business advisors go through a quality assurance process to ensure they are reliable and qualified. We offer the BLP subsidy scheme, which helps growing businesses gain access to quality business advice and support at a subsidized rate from our business advisors. Since 2018, we have supported Pacific Island businesses in many ways. We've connected over 500 growing businesses with BLP approved advisors, and through this, 222 new jobs have been created, 49% of which are filled by women. We've completed 555 subsidy projects, and 1,610 business health checks and continuity planners have been completed. For more information about the services that Business Link Pacific offers and how else we can help you, visit our website, businesslinkpacific.com. Our webinar presenter today is Kevin Fort, Founder, Executive Director, and Chief Operations Officer of Regenerative Business Institute, currently based in Arizona, USA. Kevin holds a bachelor's degree in accounting and a master's degree in business administration. He has nearly 20 years of finance, accounting, and business development experience, and has spent the last 6 years studying cooperative and ESOP business structures. His true passion is working with entrepreneurs to build financially viable, ecologically focused, and community-centric businesses. At RBI, he leads the Institute's cooperative development initiatives. RBI is now a BLP quality approved business advisor in our network and are currently in the process of relocating to Vanuatu. Kevin is here today to present part 1 of a 2-part webinar on the topic of resilience through cooperation, specifically how businesses and business leaders can create more resilience in a time when very little seems certain. Kevin, welcome.
Good evening or good afternoon. Thank you for having me. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, all good.
Wonderful. All right, are we ready for me to take on the presentation?
Yeah, all yours.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, as Anusha had stated, RBI is in the process of relocating to Vanuatu. We had anticipated being complete with the transition in early April, but naturally, given the state of the global climate with COVID, we were not able to make that transition. So we're waiting for our travel restrictions to lift, and then we anticipate being able to make that transition over to Vanuatu. RBI does anticipate serving several countries throughout the South Pacific while we're there, expanding our reach and trying to help do what we can to spread the message of employee ownership. I got started with RBI coming out of a publicly traded company that I was a part of in the early 2010s. And upon completing that transition of that small company into a publicly traded company, that process taught me a few things about employee ownership that would fuel my fire and my professional development to pursue employee ownership. Tonight's presentation, I'm hoping will help us look at some alternatives or maybe some options that might be available to us as we look at our global environment and maybe the economy, and maybe some ways that we can look to expand our options there. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, can you see my screen okay?
I can't see it yet. Do you want to try presenting again? Yeah. Yeah, all good.
All right. So the agenda for this evening's conversation, I would like to start with a brief definition of what a cooperatively structured business is, just in case anyone is not entirely familiar what the concept of cooperation means. From there, I'd like to transition the conversation into the 7 principles of cooperation and why these 7 principles might represent a strong case for cooperatives and employee ownership in the realm of resiliency for small businesses and local economies. With that, we'll transition into a conversation around the factors that can contribute to resiliency. We'll look at how building wealth through cooperation is probably one of the strongest arguments that we have for how to truly build resilience in businesses and economies. I also would like to address in this evening's presentation common misconceptions that are encountered that RBI often has to overcome when we're looking at different projects that relate to employee ownership and cooperation. And then we want to address some of the reasons that cooperatives perform poorly or, in the worst case scenarios, fail. So the definition of a cooperative is a cooperative is an autonomous association of persons united voluntarily to meet their common economic, social, and cultural needs and aspirations through a jointly owned and democratically controlled enterprise. And this definition comes to us from the International Cooperative Alliance. Some key points that I do want to highlight here is that cooperatives are formed to meet common needs and aspirations of a community, usually for social, economic, and cultural needs. They are jointly owned and they are democratically controlled enterprises. The principles of cooperation that the majority of co-ops, I won't say that all because there are a few that have deviated away from the internationally recognized principles of cooperation, but for the most part, the majority of co-ops recognize and adhere to these agreed upon principles of cooperation. The first one is voluntary and open membership. Essentially what this means is that co-ops welcome anyone who has that common need or aspiration and is willing to exercise their democratic voice and participate is welcome to be a part and have membership in the co-op. Democratic member control. What this really means in layman's term is that the organization is controlled, owned, and operated by the shareholders of the co-op. The shareholders of the co-op being the members of the co-op themselves. Within co-ops, there's typically 3 types of membership structures that take place. That can be a consumer-based co-op where it's the customers who own the co-op. There can be an employee-based co-op where it's the workers or the employees of the company that own the cooperative. And then there's a combination where both the consumers and the employees both share through a differentiated share structure or stock structure that allows that particular entity to take form. The third principle is member economic participation. This is vital because with the fourth principle, autonomy and independence, typically what that means is that the co-op seeks to operate under its own power, its own management. And in order for that to happen, oftentimes what we're going to require is member economic participation. There's a number of ways that money can be raised from the membership. Oftentimes the goal as we work to develop projects is to not cause undue burden on the members in order to get a project off the ground, but we do like to have some skin in the game so that we can demonstrate to potential outside investors or lenders that might come to the table to put a project together that the community is invested in it and they do want to get the project off the ground. Autonomy and independence we've discussed. Moving down to education, training, and information. This is probably by far my most favorite principle of cooperation because I find the value in training both the leadership, the employees, and offering opportunities for the consumer base of the cooperative to be highly beneficial and highly powerful. Particularly when we're talking about financial literacy, being able to make sure that everyone understands the purpose of the co-op and how the co-op is intended to benefit all levels of membership. The education, training, and the information part of that really lends itself to the resiliency of the business model. Cooperation among cooperatives, it really is neat to be a part of a business structure where regardless of the industry, I can reach out to other co-ops and always find a willing and helping hand to overcome different challenges and navigate through different obstacles. And that sixth principle of cooperation among cooperatives really lends itself to that. And then naturally, concern for the community. Because co-ops are made up by community members, they are serving the needs of the community, and they're truly working to build the short-term and long-term wealth capacity of the community itself. The concern for the community is just a naturally built-in component of the business model itself. Moving into the factors and why we really want to have, or at least start the conversation around, are co-ops and employee ownership a viable means of addressing the issue of resilience in small business, small to medium enterprises? From my perspective as a business developer, the clients that I work with, the training that we provide, the first two issues that we often encounter that can affect resiliency one way or the other, both positive and negative, is the accountability and the execution of the organization. So to start with, I'd like to focus in on the accountability. Oftentimes, what I find is that particularly leaders, when they hear the term accountability, their mind immediately goes to a punitive state, meaning that they view their role as a leader to hold the people underneath them, their subordinates, accountable, and oftentimes that can be a punitive nature. And what I find is this really breaks down the trust that's needed for that relationship to really prosper. So when we're talking about accountability, it's important to understand that it's not always a punitive thing. Accountability does have a component where we have to be accountable for the decisions and the actions that we take, but it should always be a constructive, positive reinforcement. Accountability at its very essence highlights management's ability to properly align incentives. And what I mean by that is, how good is management able to get their teams, their employees underneath them in line with what needs to take place. Oftentimes accountability is passed past the managers and down. They look for reasons or why maybe the junior ranks aren't getting the job done. And from my perspective, I'm always going to push that back to management's ability to hold themselves accountable and get the job done that's required of them. Lastly, accountability for the person who's paying attention to the financials and the operations and paying attention to the metrics of the organization. Accountability will identify weaknesses and faults that are inherent in either the product, the service, or the business model itself. I'm going to go into depth in the second webinar part, specifically what I mean by this third bullet. It's an in-depth conversation. I'm afraid we don't have the time to go through it in this presentation, but suffice it to say that accountability really does help us identify those weaknesses or faults that we can use to help bolster the business and improve. Moving into the execution, this is one of the greatest challenges in business, at least that I have found in myself. And I do make it a deliberate attempt to educate myself and identify different ways that I can improve on my ability to execute. I think a lot of entrepreneurs pride themselves on their ability to set a goal, and that's a wonderful skill and talent to have. And equally important is the ability to identify the tasks that are needed to execute on and accomplish and achieve that goal. Effective leaders are also really good at being able to do this for their teams. I have a saying that I work with, that I use when I'm working with my clients, that activity does not equal productivity. And I find that that's really important when you're looking from a management standpoint, is what is the activity of the organization? And is it truly productive in helping us achieve and execute on the goals that we've set for ourselves? The bullets that I put on here, the breaking the 9-to-5 grind, what I mean by that is oftentimes I do find that management is content or complacent with, maybe revenues are flowing good and we don't have too many concerns about maybe the financial position, the cash flow position of the company. But any of us who study business long enough know that business comes and goes in cycles. And breaking the 9-to-5 grind, in my mind, is the process by which we push that complacency aside. We don't expect that people are going to come in and sit at their desk from 9 to 5 and just do, the normal grind or whatever their job description requires of them. I think the businesses that are going to really thrive in the future are going to be those who are willing to look beyond that 9-to-5 grind, who are going to challenge their employees to identify problems, and more specifically, problems that their customers face, because that's the nature of business. It's the ability of the business to address and effectively address the values that the customers are seeking to gain by patroning the business. And so those businesses that can break that 9-to-5 grind and really come at the table with a creative problem-solving approach, and maybe even be willing to look at the way work is defined a little differently, might find that employees are a little bit more satisfied, maybe a little less disillusioned about the realities of work, and are more willing to contribute to the organization. Transitioning to task orientation, this was hard for me coming out of a publicly traded company, because when you're within that structure, it's very much about what the shareholders' expectations are, and there's metrics that have to be met. And oftentimes you're driving the corporation or the company towards those metrics. And what I learned coming out of that was, while that might be effective in establishing or raising share price, it often does not lead to employees that are satisfied. It often doesn't lead to customers that are satisfied. And there's a whole slew of issues that come with a very narrow focus on share value. The transition to task orientation is, what are the tasks that we can accomplish in the immediate that are going to give us the best opportunity to succeed? Or maybe a better way to say it is, if all things remain constant in my business as they are right now, what's the one thing that I could work on that would have the greatest positive impact in moving me towards the goals that I want to achieve? And I think when leaders can really change that message for their teams and get them focused on, let's focus on the tasks that we need to accomplish that are going to move us in that direction, they find a more engaged workforce that's out of that 9-to-5 grind. Having a systematic approach, well, the two prior bullets, for those who have studied the 40X, or the 4 disciplines of execution model that Franklin Covey put out several years ago, will probably find that a lot of what I'm talking about resonates from that program. I am a certified 40X administrator, and I teach companies across the globe how to institute and install the 40X system into their business. And I find that once we get through some of the growing pains and the installation pains of that program, that the culture tends to shift to that more task orientation and less about just getting through the daily grind, I guess. One of the other factors that really can contribute to resiliency is the organization's culture towards problem solving. Oftentimes what I find is companies maybe are a little afraid of tackling problems or deliberately seeking out problems within the organization. And maybe even within that construct, companies that do take that approach, more detrimental to their health and well-being from the financials and the operational standpoint, is when they do find problems, they're more apt to put a Band-Aid over the problem rather than address and get to the core root of the problem. Organizations who are able to really adapt a positive problem-solving culture, meaning we intend and we deliberately look to identify problems within the organization, whether that's with our product or service model, whether that's within the business structure. Those companies who deliberately seek those things out and address those from the core are going to find that they're going to have a more engaged workforce. They tend to have higher customer satisfaction numbers, and generally they are more resilient businesses as a whole. Resiliency does thrive in organizations that incentivize the identification of problems. I absolutely find that true in the work that I do. Obviously, given the nature of the topic with cooperation, the subject around employment and labor has to come up. And from my experience, particularly coming out of the publicly traded company, where going into it, I was hired on to finish the IPO process. And throughout that process, there were a lot of promises made to employees who had been with the company for a long time, had built the company up to the success that it had attained at that point. And they were told that they were going to be included and benefit from the IPO process. Ultimately, when that process was done, it didn't come to fruition, and I saw the devastation that had within the workforce, particularly the store managers. So this was a publicly traded grocery store company that had over 276 stores, and I knew most of the store managers very well, given the nature of my job. And talking with them after the IPO was completed, I got to hear firsthand how the decisions that management had made really affected those store managers who had built the company up to that point, and all of the employees that were there stocking the shelves day in, day out, checking customers out, really the front line of the business. I saw how that really affected them, and that really affected me. And I took that away and chose to study the ideas of cooperation and employee ownership. Because what I found was that even though the company had been successful to a certain point with the IPO, the overall resiliency of the company was very fragile. It didn't take much to shift the metrics one way or the other that would start to make management a little uneasy or a little bit concerned about where things were going. And it just didn't feel right to me that that was how business had to be. There had to be a better way to build more resiliency. And when I looked at financials, coming from an accounting and finance background, most businesses are upwards, if not more than 60% of their cost structure is typically allocated to labor or labor-related costs. And so if businesses are already making that investment for the labor component of the business to work, to me, it makes sense that we want to take care of that investment. We want to make sure that we're providing adequate training, that we treat those employees well. And in my opinion, what better way to treat them well than to treat them as owners? In this presentation, we're really only talking about the what. So those business owners who I understand have put the blood, sweat, and tears and have taken the financial risk of starting their own enterprises have the questions about, well, I took the risk. Why do we get to hand that over to the employees for the benefit? And let me assure you that no one is trying to take that component away from you. In fact, quite the opposite. We feel that when we do transitions of companies, we want to make sure that existing owners are adequately compensated and taken care of as the company transitions over into employee ownership. From a resiliency standpoint, though, if your employees feel like owners, they're going to take pride in ownership. Most often, they're going to take pride in ownership, and they're going to want to take care of the business as any other owner of the business is going to want to take care of it. From a leadership standpoint, one of the areas that RBI tends to focus on is with the board of directors and the executive leadership for co-ops. Fiduciary responsibility is, or it can be, a misunderstood, if not undertrained aspect. And when it comes to building resiliency within the financial structure and the operational structure of the business, the fiduciary responsibilities are the key starting point. So what we need these leaders and the executives and any supervisors to understand is their duty of care. And what that truly means is making informed decisions. Well, how is a leader to know what an informed decision is? How much information is necessary to be acquired? How many questions need to be asked? All of these issues need to be well understood before a decision is made in order for that person to be exercising proper duty of care. With the duty of loyalty, we're talking about acting without personal economic conflicts. You know, it's no surprise, it shouldn't be any surprise, the amount of corruption or issues that we see within conventionally structured investor-owned corporations. And at least from my perspective, I see how some of the structures within the conventional business model lend itself to that. Within the cooperatives, because it's more democratically controlled and hoping that you have true democratic participation from the membership, that acting without personal economic conflicts often is negated. But from a perspective of resiliency, we absolutely have to operate without those economic conflicts in order for the company to thrive. Duty of good faith basically means that the executive or the leader is advancing the interests of the corporation. Oftentimes that means advancing the interests of the corporation over their own, or maybe highly interested parties, or if you have highly invested shareholders or stockholders within the corporation. Within cooperatively structured businesses, advancing the interests always has to be to the benefit of the membership as a whole, not just small secular groups of the membership. Duty of confidentiality means keeping corporate information confidential. This is an easy one to violate in some circumstances, but ultimately the fiduciary responsibility for confidentiality is important for anyone who's in a leadership position to understand what that truly means. Duty of disclosure, which can be confusing when you're looking at, well, the bullet before this says I'm supposed to keep things confidential and I'm supposed to disclose in the following bullet. Well, we need to understand what corporate information is confidential and what is critical to the business operating and what needs to be transparent for the sake of gaining trust from our employees and the customers that we do business with. So that's going to conclude the section of the factors that contribute to resiliency. At this point, I want to transition this conversation into how or what we mean by building resiliency through the wealth, or building wealth through cooperation. What we see when we look at from a macroeconomics perspective, or even a microeconomic perspective in most communities, is that somewhere around 1974, in the United States, it directly relates to a piece of legislation that was passed called ERISA, or the Earned Retirement Income Savings Act. And we can see that piece of legislation directly ties into the widening gap. And basically what this graph here is showing is the top line moving up is GDP or production. So this line here translates into what businesses or what the economy is producing. This bottom line here is wages. So up until about 1974, we see that production
and wages were climbing relatively at a similar pace. A lot of that had to do with the labor unions and just how labor was structured differently. Once certain legislation was passed, at least within the United States, that's when we really see that we got away from the labor unions, we got away from employee ownership, we got away from employers being accountable to their workforces, and we saw that widening gap continue. This graph only goes up until 2010, but this following graph will show you that it continues to expand even up into 2015. And the numbers that we see up and through 2020 or the end of 2019 are no different. They're just as divergent. This is very applicable to SMEs in the fact that if we really looked at what this top line is telling us, this is your rents, right? This is your mortgage. This is the cost of land. And if we see, or it's also the cost of supplies, the direct materials that are necessary for a business to move. So if we look at the cost of a business to do business, we see that those costs are exponentially increasing. At the same time, this puts burden on households in order for them to be able to provide their necessary daily living requirements. If wages are staying relatively flat as a factor of GDP, what that essentially means to most SMEs is that the purchasing power of the typical household is decreasing because of inflation. This particular graph is specifically for the United States. I apologize. I looked to see if I could find a graph that was more relevant to the South Pacific region, and I would really struggle to find something that provided the kind of detail that I wanted to point out here. But we can see the spikes. The spikes all translate into specific policy that's passed that's intended to create economic booms. And so when we have either elections or political changes that are occurring, we can see that there's often economic policy that's passed in order to bolster numbers, and then things kind of revert back to what they are. The whole point that these graphs are driving at is the majority of the businesses that make up the numbers for these charts are coming from conventionally structured businesses, i.e. shareholder or investor-owned corporations. And those investors have a very narrow perspective about what they expect to occur with the business. Yes, they want their businesses to grow, and I want to believe that the majority of them want the businesses to provide good, excellent customer service, a good, sound product. But at the end of the day, what those investor-owned corporations are really concerned with is shareholder price. So, and here's one other graph that I felt was important to demonstrate that the ability to leverage income has been diminishing as well, and it's required more debt leverage, which requires businesses to be more dependent upon the banking industry or private equity. And as we've seen, at least those of us, I think, in the business development realm have seen that can be more difficult to obtain, particularly for your small to medium enterprises. And that just doesn't build strong, resilient communities. We know that the majority of jobs in most communities is created by small to medium enterprises, not large publicly traded organizations. And so for local economies to be truly resilient, we need those jobs to be in place, which means businesses and employers need to have access to capital. This chart I find very interesting. So this is the average weekly household expenditure by expenditure group for New Zealand. What we see is that within New Zealand, the average household is spending on average $1,349 a week for necessary household expenditures. If we were to look at the value that co-ops can provide by the very structure that they offer their co-op, their membership, we can start to run some rough numbers to really see the impact that the business structure can have. So I wanted to point out, if the average household in New Zealand is spending approximately $1,350 a week, That translates into roughly $70,000 a year in expenditures. Most co-ops are bound by an 8%, depending upon local regulation and depending upon the board of directors and the organization bylaws. But let's assume that the co-op that we're talking about that has captured a percentage, or at least this $70,000 of expenditure for this particular household, declares an 8% dividend at the end of the year. What that's going to translate into is that this household was going to spend that $70,000 regardless, but at the end of the year, because their expenditure spend went to a co-op, they're going to receive up to 8% of that dividend back. That could translate into an additional $5,600 of spending power per year per household. And when we start to break down the household budget, we can start to get a real sense of the power that co-ops can create. When we're talking about things like housing co-ops, it kind of changes the nature of ownership and what ownership of the land or of that property means. But when we look at the ability to sustain prices, we don't get the spike in housing prices when co-ops are involved, typically because co-ops aren't in the business of flipping property. They're not in the business of real estate investment for that purpose. They're in the business of investing in real estate so that they can help control the prices of housing and keep that buffered. Utilities, I am a staunch advocate that utilities are for the people and they should therefore be owned by the people, not investor-owned organizations. There are a number of cooperatively owned utility companies. They're usually more prevalent in rural environments because they're able to help get those necessary utilities to their customers. But co-op utilities to provide the necessary power and water and refuse that we're used to needing is critically important. Transportation, I think that the current state of the economy is going to really show us how important looking at new ways of transporting ourselves is. And the idea that maybe I don't have to own three cars that are valued at $50,000 a piece and sitting in the driveway and burning a lot of fossil fuels. Maybe it's not necessary. Maybe cooperatively we can work together to solve our transportation needs, and then we can reduce our costs, we can reduce our environmental impact, and that might translate into more disposable or more investable income within the household. Healthcare, within the United States, most healthcare is privately owned, which is, in my opinion, a major conflict of interest. On the other hand, you can have healthcare that is government controlled, and maybe some could argue that that's not the best situation. What about a healthcare system that is controlled cooperatively by the people who need its services, and therefore can control the costs and the services that are provided there in the healthcare system? So what we're really looking at is how can we look at different sections of the household budget and identify ways that we can give more ownership and therefore more investment power back to households through the power of cooperation. And it's when we look at that perspective, I believe that we start to identify more resilient microeconomic economic development activities that help really build robust communities. Some of the common misconceptions that we find when we're having a conversation about co-ops is that maybe co-ops don't have to be managed like conventional businesses. And this couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, co-ops have to be better managed than most conventional businesses. The reason for that is because the entire model of the co-op is dependent upon the membership's participation. And if the co-op isn't providing the value that the membership expects, the membership should, or the leadership should expect that membership is going to go meet their needs somewhere else. Co-ops have a fiduciary responsibility to build the wealth of their membership. And this is something that I worked extensively with board of directors and executive leaderships of co-ops. They have to understand that their primary responsibility is building the wealth of the membership. And that can't come at the sacrifice of the sustainability of the co-op itself. But they have to make decisions that really translate into building that value for the membership. Strong financially literate leadership is not necessary with co-ops. Again, I'm going to go back to that's absolutely false. When it comes to equity management and dealing with the equity tables that are required to effectively administer your dividends, it can be a very complex subject, and those co-ops that are most successful, they are very financially literate, and they do understand how to effectively build the wealth of the co-op and the co-op's membership at the same time. Co-ops are easy and rarely fail. Well, I think co-ops can be easy in certain circumstances, but generally speaking, if we're going to go into it thinking that this is just going to be an easy business and there's no way we're going to fail, that would be a very big misconception. It does require work. It requires a prudent approach to business, and you have to understand the value that your customer is looking for. Directors of co-ops don't have fiduciary responsibility. That's an absolute falsehood. And in most countries, board of directors and executive leadership can be prosecuted within the legal systems for not abiding by that specific country's fiduciary responsibility requirements. Conflict resolution strategies don't require practice. One of the #1 issues that I often find that can jeopardize a co-op is a co-op that does not have a sound conflict resolution strategy, and or they don't practice that conflict resolution strategy. Within the conflict resolution strategy, what we practice or help our co-ops practice is ensuring that the conflict resolution practice is clearly stated within the bylaws, because the co-op members are required to sign a copy of the co-op's bylaws with membership application. And therefore, they have agreed to and have read and understand the conflict resolution practice of the co-op. In theory, as long as everyone understands that, has agreed to it, we should be able to reach a conclusion, and hopefully everyone can come to the table when there is conflict, understanding that we're going to make the best decision for the co-op as a whole. And sometimes that might mean that your perspective or your opinion is going to be outweighed, but it should always be fair for everyone, and that should be stated in that conflict resolution strategy. Equity management strategies are simple and non-complex. They can be, depending upon the complexity of the co-op and the breadth that it has within the economy. Some equity management processes for co-ops are simple and non-complex. But I would argue that as the co-op seeks to gain more traction and maybe looks to gain more of the household budget areas, they're going to have to be very strategic about equity management and how to properly use that equity to leverage the co-op's ability to deliver expanded services and products to the membership. And continuing education isn't necessary. No, it's one of the very vital aspects and principles of cooperation. Some of the reasons that co-ops perform poorly and or fail: poor to non-existing conflict resolution strategies, as mentioned before, inadequate and or corrupt equity management, low priority of leadership development. Leadership development has to be a key strategy that's monitored. Poor operational and financial controls. Just as any other business, if you don't have sound financial and operational controls, it's going to perform poorly. And a disengaged membership base. Again, a lot of these are interrelated, and they're necessary for the co-op to be successful. So to kind of wrap up tonight, building resilience begins with the business's internal structure and management. And that shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. Obviously, we have to have our own house straight before we start dealing with outside of our house. Resiliency improves when the microeconomic perspective is included. And what I'm specifically referring to there is most investor-owned corporations, they're not really focused on what's happening in the microeconomic perspective. They're more focused on shareholder value or shareholder price. Resiliency definitely improves when we look at and focus on the jobs that are created, how well employees are paid, their ability to maintain a productive and livable living standard. Co-ops are businesses and should hold themselves to higher operational and financial performance standards than non-cooperative peers. You could argue that that's definitely an opinion, but I definitely believe that co-ops are so powerful in their ability to create wealth for people. And when they're properly managed, they're amazing to see what they can do. Equity management and conflict resolution should be proactive and practiced regularly. Both of those statements are absolutely true. And continuing education for directors and executive leadership staff and all members is one of the 7 principles of cooperation. With that, I'd like to go ahead and open it up for questions.
Great. Thanks so much, Kevin. This has been really, really informative. We've got a little bit of feedback so far from Chris Alphick, who's with Breadfruit Consulting in Vanuatu. He has said that interesting background that you've provided, and there are, of course, strong cooperative cultures in Vanuatu and elsewhere in the Pacific, and they link closely to culture, custom, history, economies, and so on. And he's hoping that you'll be able to possibly link to some of the more current experiences within the region, maybe in your next session.
Yes, I absolutely would love to provide more of that perspective.
Yeah. Do you perhaps want to tell us a little bit more about what are the types of continuing education that business leaders can be or should be pursuing during these quite trying times?
Yeah, and I'm going to address some of the specifics in the next presentation. But just to give you an idea, I think that emotional intelligence training is one of the continuing education components that's very important. Managers and leaders need to understand how to read the people that they're working with and working for. And I'm very deliberate about when I say leaders are working for, because leadership is not about being in charge of people, in my opinion, but it's about taking care of those in your charge. So emotional intelligence is really effective. Emotional intelligence training is really effective at helping leaders accomplish their tasks that they need to accomplish. Second to that is going to be some type of a strategy and execution training. I personally like the 4 disciplines of execution model because it's really good at dialing in to what is the most important thing to be working on. But I want to be careful about how I state that, because it can be misleading to say, well, this is the most important thing that we can be working on, or this is the low-hanging fruit. Those types of statements often can get you into trouble as a leader. So having the ability to identify a strategy process that you can identify how and what we're going to execute on is really important training. And then I think I would come back to the fiduciary responsibility. I think I've been practicing money from an accounting and a finance perspective for more than 20 years, and I still learn something new every day. And I appreciate that. I appreciate how I'm humbled by what I learn new about the world of finance and accounting, and how it can be used to really create positive influences for people if it's used in the right way. So yeah, I think emotional intelligence, fiduciary responsibility, and then strategy and execution training would probably be the top 3 that I would focus on.
Great. And then I have another question here from Sandra. Why is conflict resolution so highly prioritized, and how does that relate to cooperatives?
Yeah. So, I mean, culturally, we have to understand how cultures operate within themselves, and we have to be respectful of that. It should never be the intent of a co-op to try and redefine a culture, but it should be to work within the positive aspects of the culture to help build a more prosperous environment for everyone involved. Not everyone, we've all been a part of a community at some point, and we can all relate to the fact that we're not always going to agree with one another. And if we can't agree on at least a way to find common ground, then that often compounds into other issues that may even become violent or very unproductive. So conflict resolution, when it's practiced properly, when we approach it with a mature mindset, and we at least try to come to that, you're going to have your perspective, I'm going to have my perspective, but at least we're going to agree on how to disagree. Then that can be a very productive way of ensuring that the co-op is protected, even when the differing voices come to the table to express their opinions. How that relates to co-ops is because you have a democratically controlled organization, so you have a lot of voices coming to the table expressing their wants and desires, and you have to have a way to reconcile that.
Yeah, really good point. And obviously there can be conflict, but there can also be amazing productivity and ideas that come out of that. So it's definitely a plus. Yeah. If anyone else has any questions for Kevin, we've got about 5 minutes left. Please pop them in the chat box, which you can find in the top right-hand corner of your screen. And Kevin, while we're waiting for any more questions to come through, oh, actually, we've got another comment here. This is from Julianne, who owns Talk Street Consulting in Papua New Guinea, and she says, this presentation on the co-op is helping me understand the setup and how it works, as forming co-ops will be one of the things we'll be looking at forming with SMEs as part of her. She's starting an SME incubator hub, and she's saying thanks for all your information that you've provided today, Kevin.
Wonderful. I'm so glad it's helpful.
Yeah.
In this presentation, we really wanted to address the how, right? How is it that co-ops can build resilience? And in the next presentation, we're really going to try and dive into the nuts and bolts of the what. So what specific actions can you take to start making the transition into more cooperative and resilient economies?
Yeah, that'll be great. Julianne, you'll have to join us for that one as well. With the microeconomic piece that you were talking about, and I really enjoyed the graphs that you provided and the data you provided on that, especially the New Zealand spending per annum there. How did that information affect the resiliency in a business, regardless of whether it's a cooperative or a conventional business?
Sure. Without divulging too much information, I'd like to share with the group a project that RBI is currently working on for Vanuatu. And Chris, you and I will have a conversation about this Vanuatu and Fiji and many of the South Pacific countries are perfect case studies where the economic development initiatives were to bring in foreign investment, right? There was a very large push to bring in outside foreign investment. And there were a lot of promises for jobs and better livelihoods that would be a result of that foreign investment coming in. Well, the reality of it is when you bring a foreign outside investment, that investment isn't interested in staying local. It's there for one intended purpose, and that's to make more money and then to pull that money back out of the community. So if we were to look at, say, the resort industry, where we often see in the South Pacific a large concentration of outside and foreign investment coming into countries, oftentimes that investment, once it's made, ends up siphoning more resources out of the country or out of the local communities than what it puts back in. And with cooperatives, what we're really saying is we can attract that foreign investment, but it has to come from philanthropic purpose or places of origin, and it has to be really targeted from investors or banks that do the type of social investing that speaks to co-ops. But the project that we're working on in Vanuatu is to start acquiring the resorts that are currently up for sale or might be willing to sell. And we're going to put those resorts in a co-op, and we're going to push the ownership or the membership of that co-op industry, that resort industry, back to the Ni Vanuatu and the citizens of Vanuatu. Once that structure is in place, what we believe will happen, based on our experiences and other projects that we've done, is that the investments, the tourism dollars that are attracted from the co-op investing and doing its shared marketing and all of the activities that would come from a cooperative marketing association that relates to tourism, is it's going to keep the local funds circulating, and it's going to be in the hands of the people that it should be, the local community that is dependent upon that tourism industry. And that's where the resilience factor for me really comes into play. It's keeping dollars local. And the only way to do that from a business standpoint is either to have a business owner or an investor that is just very gracious and willing to let the money stay in the community, or you put legal structures together like co-ops and employee ownership, where that's just inherently built in and you don't have to worry about your resources being siphoned out of the community.
That sounds fantastic. I hope that you'll be able to come over to Vanuatu sooner rather than later. We've just about hit 3 o'clock, and so we'll start wrapping up our webinar today. I just want to say a big thank you to everyone for attending today. And Kevin, thank you so much for sharing all your specialized knowledge and expertise with us tonight for you. It's a nighttime in the States for you at the moment. Especially on this topic, which we haven't had presented in our webinar before. So we really appreciate you taking the time to prepare a presentation and share your knowledge with us today. You've clearly highlighted many reasons, the many benefits of forming cooperatives, and summarized a very large topic in a very short space of time. And I feel like you've only scratched the surface. So I'm glad that you're doing a second webinar in a few weeks' time to really expand on some of the points that you've mentioned today. To let everybody know that we'll make Kevin's presentation and today's recording available to you all via email, and you'll also be able to find this in previous week's webinars and resources on our website, businesslinkpacific.com. Kevin, any final thoughts before we wrap up?
Thank you so much for having me. It's been an honor.
Awesome. Okay, next week we'll have another webinar. This time it'll be from Mark Gerard, founder and owner of Pacific Digital Transformation Consulting in Vanuatu, and we'll be sending the invite out for that webinar tomorrow. Once again, thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you again, same time, same place next week. See you later.